Hello everyone, and welcome to the HRD Talks podcast, where we have a little break from the norm. So I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Jo Burrell, who's a clinical psychologist. She's also HR Magazine's number 11 most influential thinker, and she's not an HR person, but she is doing great stuff with the HR profession, supporting their well-being, and I'm really excited that she's here. Hello, Jo.
Hello.
So tell us a bit about yourself.
So as you said, I'm a clinical psychologist by background. I spent over 20 years in working in the NHS as a clinician and leader. And 10 years ago, I set up a company called Ultimate Resilience with my business partner, who's also a clinical psychologist. And we set it up because we were interested, really, we became very interested in workplace wellbeing, having worked in the NHS and seen lots of people in mental health services whose difficulties originated in the workplace. And in the NHS, the service model is such that you can't really address those problems at source.
Yep.
And so we were interested in doing that, and thinking about how can we tackle these difficulties before they become real problems for people, before they develop into serious mental health issues. So we set up our business and we started with looking into resilience because it's a concept which really helps us to prevent the worst impact of stress, the worst effects of stress, and that development into serious mental health problems. But it also helps us to, have a set of skills that help us to manage stress when it does happen. So, of course, there are always stress in life at some point or other, isn't there? So that's my background. And then more recently, we became particularly interested in the well-being of HR professionals.
And why was that?
Well, it was really interesting because traditionally, the people who commissioned our services were HR professionals. So we got to know quite a lot of HR people, but they weren't the people who were utilising our services. So they were commissioning our services on behalf of other people in their organisation. So they were approaching us wanting some training or some coaching perhaps for their people. And then in the period during the pandemic and just post-pandemic, they suddenly started to ask us for help for themselves. And this was a sort of notable shift from our perspective. And we wondered why this had happened. And our first question as academics and people who, as trained researchers was, where's data, where's the research out there that tells us about the mental well-being of HR professionals? So we went in search of that data and found...
Let me guess.
Indeed.
There wasn't any.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
I mean, the CIPD do a member survey, I think, every couple of years, and they just introduced 2 questions about the well-being of their members.
Okay.
And that's amongst, I don't know how many questions, but there's a lot of them. And so apart from that, I found nothing. So I thought, well, let's create some data. If this is an unresearched area, let's create some data. So we decided to design a survey. And in the back end of 2023, we published that survey and we had 100 respondents. So it was a bit of a pilot, really. We were just giving it a go, see what happened. We then produced a report, and on the back of that report, we actually got quite a lot of, it got quite a lot of attention. And I think that's because we were tapping into something that was clearly an issue. So although we only had 100 respondents, which is clearly not representative of the whole of the HR profession, we were shining a spotlight on something that was resonating with people very deeply. And so then we got interested in, well, if there's a serious problem here with the HR, with the mental well-being of HR professionals, and our survey results were suggesting there was, what can we do about it? Are there services that we can provide that can help specifically HR professionals? And so we launched our HR supervision service towards the end of last year. And at the same time, we also designed the second version of our HR mental wellbeing survey, which we conducted in the early part of this year. And the report is now out. And we had 1,421 respondents.
I was going to say there was a few more, I understand.
Yeah, to this report, which was brilliant. I mean, it was way beyond what we were hoping for. So we were so pleased to get that kind of response. But again, I think it really highlighted that this is a very real problem for people, and it really connected with something that is, quite deeply that is really going on for people in the HR profession. Yeah. And, since then, it's become a super passion of ours. In this past year or so, we've just become incredibly passionate about raising awareness about the mental well-being of HR professionals and talking about what the causes are and what's going on, because I think it's actually quite a complex picture. And also in really promoting the idea that HR professionals clearly need more help and support in relation to their well-being.
So would you share some of the results from the survey with us?
Of course, yeah. So as I said, we had almost 1,500 respondents and we used a range of different measures. So we used standardised measures of depression, anxiety, burnout, well-being. And it was important to us to use these measures because they produce statistically valid, numbers, results. They're not just a set of numbers or people saying things. This is really meaningful stuff. Yep. And these are measures that, questionnaires that we would have used in our clinical work when we were doing therapy with people. So what we found was that 44% of respondents met the threshold for clinical depression. So almost half of our respondents are experiencing really significant symptoms of depression. And compared with the general population, that's 2.5 times higher.
Wow.
Than we would expect to see. So we're using ONS data to look at what's a prevalence of depression, clinical depression within the general population. So this figure is 2.5 times higher than that. 38% meeting the threshold for clinical levels of anxiety, which is 1.5 times higher than in the general population. We found in terms of burnout, 63% were very likely to be experiencing burnout, and an additional 15% at risk of burnout. So again, well over half of our respondents, struggling. Yep. Clearly struggling. And then 67% were in the category for low levels of well-being. And then we also asked a number of other interesting questions. So we asked about what people's main sources of stress were, for example, and the things that came out the top. So we had a tick box selection of about 15 items. Yep. And they included things like lack of influence, lack of training, attrition levels, those sorts of things. So people got the chance to tick their top 3 most, biggest contributors to stress for them. Yep. And the things that came out top were 50% of people said workload, probably unsurprising. 41% said poor management, and 29% said lack of support. And then we also had a sort of open text other section where people could just write in other things that they felt were contributing to their stress. And lack of recognition was one. Toxic workplace culture was another that came out. And the emotional toll of the work was also another big factor that came out in terms of identifying the kind of key contributors to stress. We asked also, are you considering leaving the profession? And 42% said yes. So we've got a very high number of people who are feeling ambivalent, at least, at the very least, about their job and their profession. Interesting.
And do you have thoughts on why the HR profession's in that state? Obviously, they're very revealing stats based on, a good chunk of people. Are there kind of more general trends that you've kind of identified as potential causes?
I mean, this is such a complex question. I think, and the more I get to talk to HR professionals and the more I learn about, their experiences, and people reach out to me and I get, messages on LinkedIn and by email and so on. And the more that I'm doing, HR supervision with individuals, the more I realise how complex the picture is. And I think there are so many different factors. I think there are individual factors. I think there are cultural factors within the profession. I think there are factors to do with organisations and the way that they perceive HR professionals. But certainly one of the things I think is that this is a problem that's been going on for a long time. And I think that it's partly a feature of the fact that the HR remit and role has changed very significantly over the last 20 or so years, is my understanding. Yeah. And it's moved from, it's been professionalised. It's moved from being a kind of essentially an admin role,
Yep.
to a role that includes a whole range of different things. And, that's sort of, I suppose, one of the ways that we see that is that there are lots of role titles now, aren't there? I mean, I've struggled, to get my head around all the different titles in HR.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that says something, I think, about the sort of complexity of the job, And actually, you can have two people who work in HR doing very, very different things, can't you?
Yeah.
But I think that with that broadening of the remit has come higher expectations. And I think often people struggling to understand what HR do. And then there's that sort of disparity between, actually, I'm doing quite a lot and other people not really seeing it.
Yeah.
I think also the pandemic was a big thing. I think that HR professionals were really, the hidden sort of heroes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
through the pandemic. We talked a lot about frontline workers, key workers like NHS professionals and supermarket workers and bus drivers.
Yep.
We didn't talk about HR and what they were dealing with, but actually so much stuff landed on their plates. And then immediately after the pandemic, a whole load of other stuff came rolling in. So you've got a cost of living crisis, you've got increasing rates of mental health struggles amongst employees, which all that stuff goes to HR.
Yep.
You've got changes in legislation, which I know very much about.
Hybrid working, whole new
hybrid working, new policies and procedures that are going on all the time. All of that's on the desk of HR.
Yep.
So there's been absolutely no let up for them. And then I think there's another factor, which is wellbeing has become is part of the the remit of HR very much now, and in a very broad sense. So yes, they're responsible for commissioning wellbeing initiatives, but stuff related to wellbeing also goes to HR. So when you've got someone who's struggling emotionally, someone who's got some personal thing going on, it gets sent to HR. That person gets sent to HR, often because other people don't quite know what to do in those situations. And so HR professionals are finding themselves in situations where they are on the receiving end of some incredibly distressing material, I think. And they're also involved in some very complex interpersonal relationships and in exchanges, which can have all sorts of impact on them. So they're delivering bad news. They're often in the thick of, tricky, toxic, dynamics. They're being called in to deal with those kind of things.
Yeah.
So I think there's an incredible emotional toll that has emerged with the widening of the remit, that hasn't been met with really any sort of thought about how do we support these people who are receiving all of this stuff and who are experiencing all of this stuff. There's not been, it doesn't seem to me, much of a debate or an exploration into how do we protect HR people who are so crucial in a business. They're performing such a central role. How do we protect them, given that they are receiving lots of stuff that actually lots other people don't want to have to deal with? They send it all to HR, and there's a reason they send it to HR, because it's complex and it's distressing and difficult. Yeah. And there's not been a discussion about what do we need to do to protect these people. And therefore, what happens is everyone expects them to just cope. And I think that's actually, they've really suffered as a consequence of that. Yeah. And actually organisations have suffered too as a consequence of that, because if they are suffering to the degree that our survey suggests they are, then that's going to have an impact on the whole of the organisation.
Yes. Well, and they're unlikely to be performing at their optimum levels for a start, I guess. Yeah, agreed. Okay, and one of the really interesting things that I know that you are focusing on, therefore, is HR supervision, which is a concept that I was familiar with from the NHS, mainly because of my dad, who was also a clinical psychologist. And I remember him explaining to me, some of the stuff that profession has to listen to and deal with, and those kind of issues are incredibly difficult, and having some outlet for that is really helpful. Is that the same thing that you're effectively doing for HR?
Essentially, I as a clinical psychologist myself, I've received and delivered supervision all the way through my career.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I realised looking from the outside into HR was how beneficial that's been to me. And I had a big realisation, which was in clinical psychology, supervision is an absolute given. You will be doing it.
Yep.
There's no question. It's a non-negotiable. and you're trained in the methods and approaches of supervision right from the moment you start training. So it's embedded right across the profession. So what that means is that once you qualify, you're ready to supervise other people. And so it's a self-sustaining system. You know, we're all supervising each other.
Yep.
And we're all trained in the skills of supervision, and therefore we're supporting each other all the way through our careers. And I realised that the presence of that supervision within my profession meant a lot. It meant, of course, that I benefited from it in terms of my professional development and my personal needs. As you said, the impact, the emotional impact of the work, and a place for me to go to talk about that.
Yep.
But its very presence acknowledges that I needed something, that the work that I do is tough.
Yep.
And it will have an impact on me. And I will need somewhere to take that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's the problem in HR, it seems to me, is that there is no system of support, no clear system of support, and therefore there's an assumption that no one needs anything.
Yeah.
So immediately I was like, this is a no-brainer to me.
This is easy.
This is a model which has worked so well for me in my career that I can see will work really well for HR too. Now, what I was receiving was what we call clinical supervision, and that's designed for clinicians. And of course, HR professionals aren't clinicians.
Yep.
But many of the models of supervision aren't necessarily clinically focused. And in fact, we already have a precedent of supervision being used outside of HR because people who are coaches receive supervision and they're not clinicians.
Yep.
So there's already that. There's only one more step to take in order to move it into HR. And at its very kind of basic level, supervision is really a personal and professional development approach. So it is there to support your professional skills and development, to help you with the skills and techniques of your work. But it's also there that the personal bit is all about helping you to process and deal with the sort of personal challenges of the job that you do.
Yeah.
And, it's very much has, lot in terms of its methods and ways of working. It has very, some similarities with things like coaching and mentoring and that kind of thing. There's definitely some crossovers and counselling, but it has its own models and approaches too. So it's a very clear, designated approach. And I just thought, why has this not been happening before?
Yep.
And actually, we're really well placed to be delivering it because we're already trained and we've been doing it all of our professional lives.
Yep.
And so, so we launched our service in the autumn last year, and it's become our fastest selling service, our most popular service.
I was going to say, how's it been received? But it's been received very well. I mean, I think there are all sorts of barriers, to this becoming embedded in HR because there hasn't been anything like it before. Yeah.
And so I think there's lots of people who would say, well, we've never had it before. Why would we need it now? And actually, I've already talked about why I think people need it now, because this is a profession that's changed massively over time, and the demands and the challenges have changed too. And we have the data now which demonstrates that there's been a very serious impact, immense impact on the profession.
Yeah.
So the rationale is very clear, I think. And it's, like I said, is not just about protecting the well-being of HR professionals. It's about the whole organisation, because as you said, if HR professionals are on their knees, struggling with burnout and depression and anxiety and so on, then they're not performing at their best, they're not serving the organisation in the way that the organisation needs them to.
Yeah. So at that organisational level, what do you think needs to change? We've got plenty of time.
Where do I start? What I hear from HR professionals, and it's one of the things that come out in our data, is that they feel very unheard and unrecognised and unvalued and undervalued, and they feel they lack influence often. Not always. I think there are some great organisations that are really utilising HR in the way that they should be and deserve to be, and there are great organisations that are supporting them too in that way. But these are the themes that I hear from HR professionals when I talk to them.
Yeah.
So I just think, there's something about recognition, which is really important. And we know there are connections between recognition and mental well-being.
Yeah.
If you feel recognised and seen and heard and acknowledged, in your job, then your well-being is likely to be better. So at that very basic level, just recognizing people, recognizing that actually the job that they do is of immense value, but it also has an impact on them. But I think that in a more sort of systematic way, I'm a big favour of, big fan of taking a systematic approach when it comes to well-being, because I see, as someone who's a healthcare professional, I see lots of examples of organisations taking this very ad hoc approach to well-being.
Yep.
And I just, I think it's a waste of their time. It's a waste of everyone's time.
Yep.
If you're not approaching this in a systematic and a strategic way. And so I think organisations need to be thinking in a strategic way about how they support HR professionals over the longer term, not just with the odd workshop here and there.
Yep.
How do they support their teams? How do they support them as individuals? What systems do we need to put in place in order that they can do their best job and be in the best place to be able to do that?
Yeah.
And I think supervision is one of those systems, and one of the great things about supervision is that it's meant to be something that you get regularly over the longer term. It's not a short-term intervention.
Yeah.
And the reason that it's a longer-term intervention is because when you're getting that support on a regular basis, you're protected. It prevents you from getting to that point where you're on your knees with depression and burnout. That's why it's there.
Yeah, makes sense. And then what about the profession itself? So obviously there's a huge number of HR people out there. They have, professional body and so on. Do you think collectively there's things that can be done?
Absolutely, I do. One of the things I think would be, would do HR professionals a huge favour would be to have some kind of clear standards around mental well-being for HR professionals. And that might be about measurements and metrics. In order to know how well your HR people are doing, you need to be doing some measuring and having some metrics in place, don't you? So it might be about that, about organisations making sure that they're checking in. It might be about regular wellbeing check-ins. It might be about a minimum standard in terms of the support that people receive. So I think that the HR professional bodies could be doing a lot in that space, in promoting and driving, the notion of having some kind of clear standards in place around the mental well-being of HR professionals. And I think the second thing that they could be doing is training HR professionals in supervision skills in the same way that I've received.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, it's a no-brainer because what it means is that you're then, you're producing professionals who are ready to support each other.
Yeah.
And so you have a system already there. You don't have to get external people you don't have to spend money.
Yeah.
And you've got a system there that works. And I'm not saying it's a perfect system. Of course it's got its flaws and it doesn't always work, but it's going to do a damn sight better than what's there now, which is very little.
Yeah, and I guess you're building in resilience from the outset then, aren't you? As
Absolutely.
part of that, which is good. And I think an acknowledgement that the profession is a tough one to be in at times too is a good point. What about individuals themselves? So obviously we've kind of looked at those three different levels, haven't we? Organizational, employers, the profession, but there's a certain amount of self-responsibility, if that's the right phrase.
Absolutely there is. And I think this speaks back to what I was saying earlier about the sort of complexity of the picture here, which is that I think that HR professionals themselves are often reluctant to speak up. And I think there are good reasons for that, because they're met with this expectation that they should just cope. They receive that expectation all of the time. Yeah. And so it feels shameful to say, I'm not coping, because people say, they expect them to be the one who have all the answers, And I know what that's like as a clinical psychologist. I've been met with that expectation too, that I shouldn't ever suffer or struggle. Yeah. But we know we're human beings. Everyone struggles and suffers sometimes. So I think that there are these barriers in place that make it very difficult for HR professionals to say, I need help, or to reach out for help. But I think that the more that we talk about this, the better. So I think that's the first thing. Let's talk about it.
Yep.
Let's raise awareness. And we know that with every campaign, if you think about cancer, if you think about men's health,
Yep.
you know, the more that we talk about it, the less stigma there is.
Yes.
And the more we're likely then to move into the action phase, the more likely we are to take action and to realise that we need to take action and do something about it. You know, it's through those sorts of campaigns that we've changed. You know, health has changed, hasn't it?
Yep.
You know, our health status more broadly has changed. Campaigns around things like smoking.
Yep.
I mean, it's really changed the landscape, hasn't it?
Yep.
So just talking about it and raising awareness and sharing and, you know, is the first thing. And I say, and I know there are barriers and I acknowledge those barriers, but I would say don't be afraid to ask for help, because actually people are often surprised when they do ask and they get a positive response. I think people certainly fear that they're going to be judged or stigmatized in some way, or they're going to be met with a negative reaction. But many times when I'm working with people individually and I suggest that they might speak to their employer, they're surprised at how positive the response has been. That's not to say that some people don't receive a negative response, because they clearly do. And that's been, you know, once you've been batted down once, you're not going to speak up again for a long time, are you? The trust is gone. The psychological safety is gone. And I think there are ways that people can be reaching out, because I think, you know, there's lots of HR professionals who are in lone jobs too. So there isn't a network for them immediately available. But I think there are lots of, you know, one of the great things about the internet is that there are places where people can go, and networks all over the place, whether it's in social media or outside. There are places people can go to connect with others who are like them. And again, the more that we do that, the more that it normalizes our experience. You know, one of the really interesting responses we've had to our survey is that people have been emailing us after receiving it. And the one big thing we hear is, I'm so glad to know that I'm not alone. And that actually, you know, slightly brings a tear to my eye. You can see, can't you? Because I think that's so powerful, because, and what it tells us again is that people feel incredibly isolated. And so when they meet someone else who says, I know what that's like, I've been there, I felt that too, I had that response, it normalizes everything. People go, oh, thank goodness, it's not just me.
Absolutely.
I'm not just crazy or at fault or faulty in some sort of way. It's just normal. I'm a normal human being just like that other person is.
And we should probably give a little shout out to the Elevate Hub, of which you and I are both experts in, and Claire Cathcart's good work there. I think for me, primarily, those standalone roles real benefit from those kind of networks, as you've described.
Yes,
for sure. The other trend that I have noticed that is really interesting, given what you found in the survey, is people leaving the profession, the HR profession, both to go do completely different things and just walking away from HR altogether. But increasingly, people coming out of kind of corporate organizations, setting up as consultants and kind of doing their own thing, the whole rise of fractional HR directors and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of see that that's a good thing in some ways, because it gives people flexibility, and across the kind of the world of work, as it were, we were seeing more of that, people wanting more flexibility, working in more flexible ways. But it seems to me if everybody walks out of the profession in corporates and you end up with people just isolated doing their own thing, it changes the HR profession quite significantly. And it seems like it's pretty big. You know, there are consultants now who are helping HR consultants be HR consultants even. Do we need to sort of stem that tide? You know, that was it 42% of HR people are considering leaving the profession. What do you think? Have you seen the trend, and what do we do? Of course
we do. I mean, I think surely, you know, CIPD doesn't want all of its HR professionals leaving in droves from, you know, paid employment into self-employment or setting up their own consultancies, like you said, and small businesses. Of course, there's a need for that. But for organisations, I would think it's not the most cost-effective way of utilising HR services. And we see that in the NHS too, interestingly. You know, that's what I'm thinking about as someone who worked in the NHS for a long time. one of the worrying trends there is you've got people leaving because it's so tough to work in the NHS, and then they're paying outsiders.
Yeah.
They're paying agencies
Yeah.
for nurses to come in. And it costs us as taxpayers a load more money.
Yeah.
So clearly that's going to be the case in HR too. And in the private sector, it's going to be the same. So absolutely, I think we need to be stemming the tide.
Yeah.
And therefore, a load of measures need to be put in place, don't they, to make the experience of being an HR professional a less lonely one, a less damaging one, distressing and damaging one. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. One of the things that is kind of coming across as part of the supervision thing is that this is a support mechanism for the profession. Why is that actually useful? Why is it powerful? What does it kind of achieve?
So one of the things that we found in our report was that only 13% of our respondents said that they felt well supported at work. So that leaves 87% of respondents feeling that the level of support for their mental well-being at work is insufficient to some degree. And actually, half of our respondents, it was seriously lacking.
Yeah.
They were saying it was seriously lacking. And one of the things, because we had, a good response rate, we were able to sort of interrogate the data a bit more. And I think one of the most fascinating findings from this survey was that we looked at, if you're someone who has high or low levels of support at work, what does that mean for your mental health, for your likelihood of wanting to leave the profession, for your likelihood of having taken time off work over the last year due to stress? And we found probably what you're expecting to hear, which is if you're feeling well supported at work, your mental health is much better, your well-being is better, you're much less likely to be suffering from burnout. You are much less likely to be thinking about leaving the profession, and you are much less likely to have taken time off sick in the last year due to stress. And so there is this incredibly powerful link between supporting people at work and all of those other factors. And this was a very statistically significant finding.
Yeah.
So we know it's very strong. And, if you're an employer, you look at that data and surely you can see there's a saving to be made, a massive cost saving to be made if you invest in supporting HR properly.
Yep.
Because you're saving on, replacing people who've decided to leave. You're saving on sickness absence. You're saving on the, presenteeism, which is very common in people who are struggling with their mental health. People are turning up at work, but they're really not performing anything like at their best.
Yep.
You're saving on, performance being damaged by mental health issues. So you're making massive savings across the board. And of course, as we said earlier, if your HR professionals are performing well, that's benefiting everyone in the organisation, isn't it? And if they're performing poorly, then that's having an impact too.
Yeah.
So you're saving there as well.
Yep. Cue everybody sharing the episode with their boss.
Absolutely.
The CEO numbers listening to the podcast is about to go through the roof. No, I think that's really, really useful, and it makes complete sense. But, clearly the research is backing that in a big way by the sounds of things. We've referenced the report that you guys produced off the back of the survey a number of times. Where can people find that? How do they get their hands on it?
So you can download a copy on our website, which is ultimateresilience.co.uk. And there is a button on the homepage. You just click on there and it will take you to the page where you can download the report.
Fantastic. One of the other things that we do on the podcast is a supplier shout out. Anybody that you would kind of highlight in this space or something completely different that, people should check out?
So workplace wellbeing is my passion now. And obviously I've become even more passionate specifically about the wellbeing of HR professionals now. But, it's a world that I've been sort of circulating in for about 10 years. And there's someone called Gethin Nadin, who is a psychologist.
Yep.
An organisational psychologist, and I just think he speaks so much sense.
Yep.
I think he as a psychologist, he's very evidence-based. He draws on the research in a really useful and accessible way to argue the case for investing in well-being at all sorts of levels and all types of different, financial well-being and, all sorts of aspects of well-being. But I think he just argues a fantastic case. And so I would say follow Gethin.
Yeah.
And he's also doing some great work now, actually lobbying governments and MPs around well-being in the workplace.
Okay.
So he set up a policy liaison group specifically around workplace well-being and is inviting experts to be part of that. And so he's making great strides, I think, so he's not just talking the talk, he's really living it too,
Yeah. Brilliant. And we'll tag his LinkedIn profile as well as Joe's in the blurb for the podcast. The other one, slightly broader, Joe, in terms of workplace well-being, we talked partly prompted by some new government announcements that I posted on LinkedIn about this morning, the best approach for getting people back to work. So there's obviously, I think it was something like 11 million sick notes given, nearly all of them signing people off without a kind of action plan for getting people back to work. And the post kind of has, grown legs, and people are talking about more proactive approaches to avoiding employee sickness absence in the first place. As always, you were very insightful on that as well. The wider picture beyond HR, clearly it includes HR, but the wider picture of how do we keep people well and in work? What are your kind of thoughts on that?
Again, it's a big question, but one thing I would say is that, coming out of the NHS and working in a workplace wellbeing setting in workplaces, I was really shocked at how far behind workplaces were in terms of their kind of knowledge and understanding of how we keep people well and how we support them when they're not well. And so what I've seen is this kind of piecemeal ad hoc sort of approach. And of course, the pandemic really shone a light on well-being in the workplace, and organisations have suddenly seen that, they have a really, really important role to play in supporting the well-being of their staff. And actually that's going to benefit their business if they do that. So, they're learning, and that's fine. It's important that they do that. But I think that I see still way too many organisations who see the latest thing that's been marketed in a slick and shiny way and think, well, that's the thing we need then. And they haven't done their background research. They haven't gone, well, what's the demographic of my workforce? What type of work do they do? And therefore, what sorts of stresses are there in their work? What are the pressure points? What are the pain points here? So if you investigate that first, then you've got some bespoke data that tells you something about what's going on in your workforce. And then you can think about, well, you can tailor your approach, can't you?
Yep.
Rather than going, oh, we need mental health first aid. And there's nothing against, I've got nothing against mental health first aid, but I think there are loads of organisations who've just gone, oh, we'll send some people on mental health first aid training without thinking about how that's going to be utilised, whether they need it, how it's going to be utilised, how they're going to support their mental health first aiders when they find themselves in very tricky conversations with employees who might be suicidal, for example. What the process is for rolling out that function. And I still see way too many organisations who are doing that. Yeah. And so I realise that it takes more thought to sit down and say, okay, what's the problem? To investigate that problem first of all, and then to design a response on the back of that investigation. I realise it takes more time than just go, oh, we'll have that. But in the long term, you're going to save so much more money. And you're going to save in all sorts of other ways too, because actually if you deliver a wellbeing intervention to your organisation, to your workforce, and it falls flat on its face, all you're going to do is you're going to create a sense of disillusionment, and you're going to break trust, and you're going to leave people feeling, certainly going to leave people with potentially quite serious problems with stress or other mental health or physical health problems, and they're not going to come and ask you for anything further because the thing that you delivered the first time didn't hit the mark.
Yep.
You hadn't really asked them what they wanted or needed. And it's the simplest thing, isn't it?
Yep.
If you think there's a need, ask people. Would
this
ask
be
people,
helpful?
What do you need? What do you think the problem is? And what do you need?
Yeah.
Simple. What are your ideas about? You don't have to take on every single idea.
Yeah.
But I think organisations are often fearful about asking those questions, aren't they? They fear that they're going to get an onslaught of. But, there are ways of managing that. If you do get an onslaught, there are ways of managing that too. So I just think I absolutely encourage organisations to take this kind of systematic, strategic approach, because it will reap so many benefits for you if you do that.
Yeah, interesting. Then taking it up a level even further, are we all just more stressed? Like, is the world just a more stressful place and employers are having to grapple with some of that?
Well, the figures suggest that we are, certainly in the workplace. Stress is the biggest source of workplace absence now, according to the Health and Safety Executive. And despite the additional efforts that workplaces are making now in relation to workplace wellbeing and other related things like engagement and that kind of thing, the numbers are still going up. So that speaks to my point about, what you're doing at the moment is not working.
Yeah.
And there's good evidence also for that. There was a study that was done in Oxford recently, about a year ago, which demonstrated that most wellbeing interventions aren't actually leading to, the sort of outcome that we're looking for. So there really needs to be a massive rethink. And one of the things I think we need to be thinking about is in workplaces is workload, because actually that's the thing that comes out top time and time again. It came out top in our survey of HR professionals, but it's a theme that's much broader than that. And it's not just about how much work do I give people, how much work is on my desk sitting there looking at me. I think it's also to do with the way in which work has infiltrated the whole of our lives now. So with modern technology, with phones, with computers and laptops and the internet and all that kind of stuff, we can access our work anywhere. And we need organisations to be helping us to set boundaries in place. We need them to be encouraging and supporting us to do that, because at the moment, I think the onus is very much on individuals, and they feel this expectation, don't they, coming from the organisation, and they see other people answering emails at 10 o'clock at night or submitting reports at 2 in the morning, and they feel then that that's what they should be doing too. And I think we need a campaign, really, a national campaign, a global campaign, because this is not just happening in the UK, that really alerts us to that shift that's happened. Because, when I first entered the workplace, I went home at 5 o'clock and I didn't, I might have thought about work, but I didn't have access to anything to do with my work because it was all there on my desk. And so naturally, it was much easier to protect that leisure time. And that's what we need if we're going to be well and be protected against the worst effects of stress and burnout. We need that recovery time. We need that protected recovery time. So we need our organisations to be helping us to have that. Yeah,
interesting. And I guess along those lines, but specifically for HR people, and it may be that, it applies to all of us as humans, but, we're focusing on HR people. If you were to give kind of final closing advice, as it were, to HR professionals about looking after themselves, what would that be?
I would say talk to each other, because like I was saying earlier, it's so powerful when you meet someone else who's experiencing something that you might feel some shame or a stigma about, that might make you feel like you're not good enough, that might knock your confidence. And so to be able to just talk to someone else about those experiences and recognise that they might be experiencing them too, or they might know someone else in HR who's experiencing them. It's a simple thing, but normalising is so powerful. And I know that from working in mental health services, for most of my career. I did a piece of research on self-help groups way back when, and that was one of the big themes that came out, was that they were powerful because people met others who were experiencing what they were experiencing, and it normalised that for them, and it made them feel like they weren't at fault or to blame. So I would say at the very simple level, talk to each other.
Yeah, I like that. Who would have thought communicating and talking to each other was so powerful? It's brilliant. It's an excellent way for us to finish. So thank you so much, Joe, for sharing all of that. I'm absolutely certain it's going to be so useful for all of the HR listeners. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the HRD Talks podcast. Hopefully you found the discussion helpful. If so, please follow us on your podcast provider to be notified of future episodes and share with friends and colleagues. For more information on the podcast, please visit actons.co.uk/the HRD Talks.